Hi, my name is Mark Stiles, and today I'm going to be presenting mining the xDB, a pipeline for high-powered insights. And so what I want to really get across from this talk is the importance of the xDB's collection database. There is a lot of value in it, and what I hope to show you here is how to extract that value for your company. I do want to say that this isn't I'm not the first person to try to do this, but it is kind of a short list of people. One attempt was done by an Adam Robato at Valier, and he used a different technology stack with data exchange framework and the XConnect APIs to pull the data out into files, move it to Amazon, and then into a marketing business intelligence platform. There was another, Boris Brodsky, and he used Azure Data Factory to query the OData connector and move that data up to a business intelligence platform. This is a bit different. This is straight from SQL, so I'm getting all of the data, and I'm moving it to just another database, but I'm bringing several databases worth of data into one place so that they can be queried and merged and joined and aggregated all together, all for the same purpose. And that's what I want to show you is that how we could go about trying to reclaim the mantle of the power of xDB and provide authors and content managers systems to be more informed about what their audience is doing and help them make better decisions. Okay, there we go. So what I want to do is walk through first is the reporting systems that Sitecore has had in the past, because it would probably help to just understand how it got to where it is, and then maybe where it could go from there. And so let's take a first look at the Executive Insight Dashboard. This was something that was released in 2012 with Sitecore 6.6. It was a Share UI app inside the desktop, and you could open up a modal and it would show you a little bit of some of the analytics, a little bit of the refer traffic, and some of the points if you had goals added to your pages. And so you get a little bit of insight of just where the value is coming from and going to. But it was kind of a first look application. It didn't have a lot of features or anything. And then there is the Experience Analytics, which is probably the most well-known version. This was released in 2014 with Sitecore 8. And it was shortly followed up in 2015 with the addition of the X profile. And so the analytics system here just provided a lot of new UIs, bar charts, pie charts, interesting graphics, metrics, things that were, as they added new types of data that they were tracking, they wanted to be able to surface that information in new ways and in sort of a nice, colorful way. But some of this was, I think some of it was really limited. I think there was just not a lot of ability to extend it. And that's kind of where we're at right now. The X profile was an addition. So this was to help understand the life cycle of the individual visitors and see what events occurred. And maybe if you had a ticketing system or call center and somebody called in and had an issue, they could look at the history and say, oh, okay, we saw you. We know who you are and we know what was happening. So we can help you. I don't think it was ever really used that much like that, but potentially some places, but not a lot. And so I don't know as much of the value of this dashboard, but it did help provide places for adding custom facets, contact facets, things where we could store additional information against users and their behavior. So that was really valuable. But I'm not sure exactly how much this view was ever really surfaced. And then there's Sitecore CDP. Sitecore CDP is a new system altogether. They were a separate company purchased by Sitecore in 2021, and they were a completely different data stack. They really have a very different system and tooling. They have quite a bit of an advanced ability. They can do nearly real-time analytics. You can tailor a lot of the views to your specific business. But it's a paid-for business, you get a lot more for it, and they have a a timeline where they're releasing different features, so that they're pretty on top of what they do. So it's a different system altogether. If you ended up getting this, you probably get a lot out of it. But I think this is really where we're trying to get to, which is that the xDB itself and the experience analytics didn't really provide this type of experience. And what we want to try to do is put that, we want to right that ship. We want to bring those xDB analytics into the place where they can do a lot more similar to what CDP can do. And in the event that you stay on Sitecore, you don't miss out on some of the great features. And if you end up moving to Sitecore CDP eventually, you'll kind of have already a better understanding of what you should be expecting in the first place. And so this is kind of where we take that turn, because I think what the subtle under subtext here is that the reporting system as it is doesn't really work. The experience analytics is not really a very useful tool for the content managers to know what decisions to make. It surfaces some, I would say, ordinary statistics, but not necessarily anything insightful. Nothing that was going to help make people make better decisions about where to spend their time or what's working, what's not working. It's just summary statistics, but nothing at a much deeper level. And anything that you wanted to do at a deeper level would be fairly challenging, because you have to understand a lot of the core.NET libraries and the different connectors and systems, and you have to understand what Speak is, which is their proprietary UI. And all those things have really become a hindrance for this becoming a really valuable tool for content authors. I think it's really held XP back in a lot of ways. And I don't necessarily going to read this entire thing here, but it was a really thought out argument about why we should move away from the way it is. Tracking is still really valuable, but the system of reporting in UI is not. So the long and short of it is Sitecore built this far before the modern data stack existed. So they were building a lot of things by hand, by themselves, and didn't necessarily have what we have today available to us. So it just is what it is. And I think it's time to just take that step, move towards a modern data stack and build something that is going to work. And we can use the data that's already being tracked. We don't necessarily have to go do anything different there. We just need to find a way to move it into a place where we can see it and act on it. And so I know this is a little bit of a touchy subject, but I do want to show that I have put thought into it, and this is a very thoughtful decision. Because really what we're trying to do is make the relationship between the content authors and their audience tighter. We want them to enact certain things that they think are going to work. We want the audience to respond, and we want them to know what that response was, so that they can continue doing the things that work and stop doing the things that don't. And over time, they would evolve together to have a much tighter relationship. So let's talk about what a modern data architecture would look like, because there's a lot of different ways we could go about it. Every company's going to have their own pre-existing tool set. Maybe someone won't, and we'll have to fill in the gaps. But we should also have a really good high-level idea of what it is we're building, as well as a low-level idea of how we can implement. So first, we want to start with data systems, because there are a handful of different data systems that do matter. They're different in the way that they structure the data, they store the data, process the data, govern the data. They're very different. They do kind of stack up there. Data warehouse was the original data system. And then over time, the data lake was the next system. And so they were an evolution at each point. But the data warehouse is really what you would think of like a traditional database. It has a database, but it is at a cloud scale. So large, very large scale disk space, high performance. It has a fixed schema like any good DBO with the ACID transactions. And some of the products, you'll see Snowflake, Redshift, or BigQuery. But really, it has a lot more to do with the way the data is stored too, because in a data warehouse, you're not just reading the data back. You're trying, like if somebody's trying to log in, you have one row for that person. We call that a row store. We put that on the same disk, all that data for that row or series of rows. So when we look them up, we have all the data readily available, easy to read. But when we're doing things in the warehouse, we're usually doing calculations. We're trying to understand numbers. And so we're not necessarily concerned about the row of all that person's data. We're really worried about the column. We're trying to get the column stored in one place so we can get all that data instead of piecing it together, and we can calculate something really quickly. And so data warehouse is really built for that. And it's decades old, very old. It's been in existence quite a while. Data lake really came about probably more in the modern era because we had all kinds of new files available to us, videos, images, text, JSON objects, all kinds of things that aren't necessarily tabular in nature. And so the data lake really became a place just to put these things. And so large disk space with very little governance was really kind of the way it started. It just was a place to put things. And so it wasn't any governance had to be put into place kind of by yourself. You had to understand what you were trying to do and how to normalize data and bring it into different systems that you want to enact on it. If you're doing data science or machine learning or just trying to do some reporting, you had to have the process to deal with all that data. And so that's really where CDP is right now, because they're kind of like a chef's kitchen. They can do whatever they want. I believe it might be a Delta Lake. Delta Lake has a little bit more governance. They have some versioning. They can roll back in case somebody overwrote a file or something. But essentially, the idea is that it's a really large place to put your information and do your own custom processing. And that's fine if you're a company producing a service. But when you're a company consuming a service and you just want something kind of normalized in its product, you want to be able to not have to manage or think about. You end up at the data lakehouse because it brings together both the idea of this open data format with the old style structure of the databases, but with a lot of the governance that is baked into it, right? And the products you're going to see here, like Snowflake or Databricks or Fabric and Synapse, they're the ones that have those overarching governance models and really help you manage plugging one set of data into another without having to really have a software team that's going to go and build all of that. So those are the different kind of flavors that we're talking about. They go up in scale, in cost, and also power and functionality. So, but really right now, we're just talking about the data warehouse. We're not going to get into all the rest of that yet. For the time being, we really are just doing tabular data, and we're just trying to merge a couple of tables from each of the databases into one and bring some common business objects together for analysis. So let's talk about the data flow and the network architecture, because this is really where you start to see the high level of how the data moves and how we're going to try to make it move. So for right now, in today's current XP system, you have the xDB. The processing engine goes and pulls out the data as it's being collected and starts aggregating it into the reporting database. Then there's a reporting service which reads from the reporting database, and then a CM that talks to the reporting service, and then uses the Speak UI to render all the visuals that it needs to for all the plots that it has. And this is really kind of where we get stuck, because unless you do know those systems and you understand how Cortex works and the reporting aggregates and how to develop a new Speak, it's a vanishingly small number of people who know all those things. You're really looking for a really large project to get any kind of like rolling changes to your aggregate business intelligence system. And so let's take a look at what could be instead of a different future. Now we have a content and we have our analytics, and assume the analytics are the 2 xDB shards or more, depending on your system. What we'd be doing is extracting all that data and moving it to a warehouse, which would just be, in this case, another database in Azure or your SQL Server or something. But it could be anywhere. But it's just the idea of bringing all these together in one place, because you're doing cross database joins and that sort of thing is really complex and troublesome, and oftentimes just doesn't work. It's not supported. So bringing it all into one place is really how this has to happen. And then the other part is really that the extraction is, as I'll get into later, is necessary because the data is actually really impacted. And then we do transformations. So transformation is this process where we say, okay, we have all our original raw tables. Now we need to join them. Now we need to aggregate them and We need to do pivots and all kinds of things to try to build up into higher objects, get some more information out of the data that we have stored. And so that transformation is really just building a series of views and joins within the views, and then resulting into a table that you can query against with your business intelligence platform. And so you would bring that data through to your CM and into Power BI. So you have like Power BI embedded, allows you to have an iframe. You can put that into the launch pad, have a button for it, and you can go and click in and see all your plots and reports and things that you want to be able to keep an eye on as you're in the system. And what's really nice about this is that we're taking it from a .NET thing and the Speak thing, and we've converted it into a SQL thing. So the transformation is all SQL, extraction is all SQL, and Power BI is really using SQL and it's back into to query all of it. So you're really not doing any .NET projects anymore after that point. And so it's a much simpler thing, and a lot more people know that SQL, so it's much more likely for you to find somebody that knows how to help you. We can also use HTML. So again, another language very many people know, but you could be building something in high charts using just module plugins to be able to read that data and visualize it. But we can go further because we have the raw data in a raw format, and we can actually feed it into analysis and ML modeling, and we can start to build models that we could use as APIs and do predictions. And we could run rules based on these models, and we could say, I have this person, here's some metrics, give me a value of how long you think the person will stay, or how much money you think they might spend, or what category they might fall into. And so there's a lot of different value we could do. Having that data we could use to do some machine learning with. And so here's an example, Azure Resource Group, because like I said, there's going to be a million ways that this could actually be. Everybody has a different tech stack, and you're going to have to find a way to work in the same, work a solution for that company based on what they have. But in the case that they don't have anything, you could imagine that this is how it could look. And the nice thing about this is it keeps it all in one Azure Resource Group, which is really the path of least resistance. As soon as you have to get third-party systems, and you're talking about doing due diligence, and you have to go and sign contracts, and it takes a while, and it's just be able to spin up a new Azure resource inside the already existing resource group and just say, this might cost about this, but at least it's already within your system, and you already know who you're paying, and you don't have to really work about a lot of other things. So it might be just easier to have these built into the Azure Resource Group you already have hosting your system and network them. Okay, so the Azure SQL Server, which would basically be where the new warehouse would live, is just another database. You would want to script it as a column store. Like I said, it matters when you're doing the data calculations that you're doing it in that way, but you can do that. That's supported in Azure SQL, not in on-prem SQL, which is a managed database that has different features, but Azure SQL does support it. So you might have to find something different in that case, but let's just assume we're still in the Azure Web App group, and we're going to work in there. And so for the extraction and loading, you could do something like Data Factory. Pretty cost effective. It's only charging while you run it. And then for the transformation, you could use Azure Functions. It's just simple checkout of your project, and you call those scripts, and then they call into your database. And as long as it can connect, you can create those views and tables for you. And it's just executing some SQL that you've already written. And then the reports and the embeds would be the Power BI embedded. And so you could swap this out with Apache Superset or Metabase or something like that. But generally, it's however you want to handle it. But Power BI is something that most people do know, and they already have kind of a Microsoft stack, so it might just be something that makes sense. But what you would end up doing is you build a report, and it allows you to create an iframe. And the iframe calls back to the server renders the report and sends back all the visualization. But it's different because it's not a desktop app, it's a server app. And so you're just hosting your server app, you're paying a monthly fee for it, which is reasonable. It's still probably on the more expensive end of systems, but not outside most of the expense that you're already paying anyway. So it's not like an order of magnitude larger, eye-popping, eye-watering number. And then you would embed that into the pages within the CM in the Launchpad or somewhere where you could view it and secure it. And then again, if you want to go further, you have Azure ML. And so you could pipe that data into Azure ML. You have a lot of control over experiments that you could be running and data cleaning and anything else you want to do. You could wrap those up and build those into Docker and Kubernetes and launch them, and then have them as APIs that the CD could read. And then you can go even further and get like Databricks if you're really getting advanced. But at that point, you may, I don't know if this model would really serve your needs, but you could, and all of that would still fit within your Azure resource group. But what I want to focus on here in the next step is this section here, because everything else is kind of nice to have, but this is really what I think I'm trying to help find a solution for, which is to just get business intelligence back into the hands of the people who are running these sites so they know what's going on and they have a real good understanding. And at any point, they could say, I really need to answer this question. Let me go build a report that does that thing. Or if they can't, then they go to the SQL and they write the SQL, deploy it, and then they can go and create the report that they need. And then it's a much more straightforward release process and a much easier way to get that information. So let's talk about data pipeline and the architecture, because the data pipeline is really kind of how we shape the data through as it moves through once we have it into the warehouse, and how we're actually going to build it back up into business objects that somebody can connect their business intelligence to and start to really interrogate and get some information out of. So the first thing I really need to show you, and I never love showing those tables or code, but I think it just helps to illustrate the problem, right? So we have this database, you have these rows, each one of these rows is a session, basically, it's an interaction. The problem is that an interaction is already aggregated, and so you don't necessarily get fine-grained detail about the events that occurred because they live in this column here. And when you look at them, there are these huge chunks of JSON objects that are impossible to process because they're packed into this column. And so there's 14 tables that actually contain data like this. And so you have to unpack them all. And then further, in this case, the interactions table has a second level of depth that needs to be extracted again to get to all the personas and all the other really valuable data. But once you understand that, that's what we really need to do. The problem is that that data was stored in a way that's not really useful immediately, and it doesn't have a UI that's readily modifiable. So those two things have really held the system back. And so the first thing we need to do is correct that and extract those. And when you do, you start to see that there are these three types of things that we're really targeting. And so the individual pieces are events. Those are the single chunk of JSON within that larger JSON object. As you roll up, you have multiple events, and that's an interaction. You've had a session, you clicked a bunch of pages, you triggered some tests, maybe a goal or something, and then each one of those interactions is what makes you a contact. You have all the contacts or the interactions over time make you who you are in your experience. And so there's a different number of aggregate information that we can pull out. There's all kinds of values that we can start to calculate and find interesting for each one of those levels. And then we can start to really learn something about what it is you have in your database. And so the transformation set is really kind of laid out in 3 steps. There's the first step, which is the extraction and loading. And that even has its own 3 steps. So the first part is really just getting the original events in the facets table extracted. And that's just one, you're pulling that data out and you're pushing it into another database. The second part of the extraction and load is the further extraction. So like I said, there's 2 levels deep. You have to pull that out and then pull all the interior JSON objects out. And now you have a further expansion of facet tables and data. And then what we do is we take those events and we take all the references to all the items in the content tree. We go back to the content table database. And then we go and we look up all those items. We get page names, template types, we can get field values, whatever it is you need. And then we bring that back into the warehouse and put item tables together. And then we have these 4 different types of tables that we start with, raw data. And what we need to do is bring them together. We need to join some of those original facets back to the events. We need to do some aggregates so that we can roll them up. And so there's a series of views here. This is a really condensed view of what it would look like, could look like. But the views start to be that intermediate step where we're doing those joins, we're doing those aggregates. And then once we finally come to the point where we want to visualize something, we start to say, okay, we have these final objects. We're going to put those into tables. And so that's a one-time process. And what you've done is essentially calculated through all those views, all the things that you needed, and then stamped out a copy into the table. And that final table is much more performant. You can index at that point. You can do all kinds of different things. But you really are going to get the best performance now because you've completed it and said, like, okay, as of today or twice a day or however often you run this transformation, we have refreshed these tables. And we can go and visualize, we can go analyze and ask questions and learn something about that data. And so this is not the prettiest slide. So you'd be surprised how difficult it is to pretty up a list of tables and views. But I found that there were a large number of just tables. I thought it was just interesting to see how many views and tables after extraction there were. And so the ones with the prefix here, there's CF, which is contact facets. There's 6 of those. The I is the original interaction. So that's where all the events came from. The IE are the interaction events. And so those were the second level that we brought out. There's 3 of those. The IF interaction facets, and there's 4 of those. And then IT were the item tables, and so 6 of those. So those were the original raw data. And on the right, you see all the different views that we have. So there's int, which are it's intermediate, which is a DBT thing. We'll get into that in a minute. Stage, which is another level of, again, it's the same part of the transformation. It's just, we'll get to that in a minute. But there's a lot of different views in between. And then they roll up on the left side in the center image, the MART schema. Those are the final tables. And so you kind of have a mix of different things that you're going to create. This would be, this is kind of a first pass. There's a lot more data I didn't really get to, but there could be even further as we go along. But really, this is where we're starting with right now. But it is quite a bit of data and transformation. And so the transformation, when you are trying to just keep track of it mentally, is actually really does become a challenge because you have so many scripts and things that you're trying to compile. And so having a view of it is actually really valuable. And the tool that we're using to do this is DBT. And DBT, when you are using it, has the ability to provide to you what's called a directed acyclic graph, or the DAG. And so what it does, it shows you the chain of dependency. So from your tables here in the picture, which are the green, so those are your original raw tables, or your references to raw tables, and then all your views in between, and then the final object all the way at the right, which is your burger. And so to help visualize, we're really showing that there are ingredients, they get mixed up in different orders, and then they get put together to this final thing. Try to help illustrate that. So this is the actual implementation for DBT implementation for this database, which is the xDB. And so you'll notice that there's actually a much shorter list here, the green original table references than all the tables that I did create. I didn't get to them all. I've been working on this for months, but there's actually a whole lot of data, more than I could actually analyze in that time. And so there's so much room to grow here. But just take it from where we're at, the original table references in the green come in and we have some views where we clean those values up. We get rid of the nulls and do just basic checks. And that's the stage layer. And then we get to the intermediate layer. And then from that intermediate layer, which is the events, we do all of our other aggregates and filtering. And so we're doing filtering to just get the search keywords or the campaign events. So the campaigns, page views, the refers, even just a clean view of the events themselves, goals and errors. And so we're just trying to get that aggregate into a useful state so that we can start to query it. And that's what those final models are. And all the way off to the right, you'll see the context interactions. And so those will come into play later as you start to visualize that. But that's what we're really working with. And we can build these into whatever we need. Anything you can really imagine that you can squeeze out of this data, right? We can create anything at this point because it's SQL. Each one of these little blue or green elements represents a single SQL script. And so you're just adding to this project by creating another SQL script that does a specific thing and resulting in a table somewhere that you can query. And so what we're trying to do, like I said, is try to bend XP towards Sitecore CDP. The Sitecore CDP has this type of table structure in their system. So the events, which are the similar, sessions, which are interactions, guests, which are contacts, and then there's product tables, which I imagine they do a whole other host of things for their customers. So we're trying to get to that model, trying to move in that direction and get to the, have a similar, I don't think I'd ever say we could get to the same level as CDP. Obviously, they're a business, but I think we can do some really valuable things with the data that we have. And then let's actually dig into the actual mining of the Sitecore analytics. This is the fun part, right? This is really, imagine we finally got the data, we've got it shaped, we've moved it to the warehouse, it's all in a nice format that we want to look at it. What are we actually going to find? And this is probably my favorite space to be because I get to explore and you really do find some very interesting things. And so the first part of this is really exploratory data analysis. And what that means is that you really don't know what you're going to look for. You're just looking around. You're starting to piece things together, trying to build up clues, right? It's like a good detective. Maybe you start with a good question, you start to have more questions, and then before you know it, you actually start to learn something. But really, ultimately, what we're trying to do is answer business questions for the business, because the business is really what we're trying to help facilitate, right? We want them to be able to know things so they can make better decisions about where they spend their time. I think a lot of what really was struggling with was that there's so much these visualizations, they create more work for you to provide, for you to interpret. They're not necessarily like, here's some good information you can go and make a decision with. It's really like, here, try to interpret me, and maybe you can read the tea leaves after a while, and maybe you might learn something. But to me, that's so frustrating. I think what we really want to do is move past that and get to the point where we're giving insights and saying, this is where your time is best spent. You should come in and find this dashboard, something that helps you make decisions during the day, not it's just more work for you. But really, this part is just about learning something and finding answers to questions. And so the first part is really just digging into the raw data and just seeing what you have. And so what we have here in this data set is an example data set I'm using. It was for a year, a month, 8 months, and 21 days. And so you can get a sense of just like how much duration of time there was. There were 10 million points of engagement value assigned. There were 2 campaigns. There was over 19 million events, individual events. There was almost 6 million interactions and just over 4 million contacts. And so you could, even in that year, 8 months and 21 days, you could see that there's quite a bit of information. And just to give you that like initial scope, we're just seeing what the data, the ranges of the data. So the next part we'd start to look in is the actual individual columns. Now we've tracked some data. Maybe we have a sense of where the data might be sitting or what it's doing, but until you actually see it like this, you really don't know. And this view, for the uninitiated, isn't necessarily scream at you what it is. I put this up here on purpose because I did want you to understand it's not always, having data isn't necessarily informative. It takes a critical eye, and you really have to kind of know what you're looking for. And so what I'm looking at here is that there are these 3 very interesting metrics, right? The item count, page view events, and the engagement value. The item count is, think of the item count and page view as if I went to the home page and I hit refresh, that's 1 item count, but that's 2 page view events. And so where those 2 diverge, you'll start to see that people were rereading things because the item count didn't go up, but the page views did, which means they came back and they started to read it again. The engagement value is the target value, and that's the one we want to make sure it goes up. we want to maximize that value. So we're going to keep an eye on that one. The other thing you want to notice is where these very high values start to come out of where they probably shouldn't. And so pages per minute, right? There's 1,250 pages per minute. How does that make any sense? That's incredibly fast. Clicking immediately makes me go, uh-oh. Maybe there's some bots. Let's go take a look at that. Page duration at 500. That's really interesting. That means that there are people or potentially bots that stay for a very long time. And we want to know which it is. And then for errors, right? You're looking at that, and the bar on the left is telling you that a good number of people get some errors. And then a handful of people get a lot of errors. That's not great. And so we want to look into that. And this is really what we're doing is we're looking at the original values first, just the distribution. We're just saying, based on this, how many people are getting short page durations versus long, right? Most people seem to be staying for a short page duration. How many people are getting lots of errors? So that's the kind of thing we're just kind of pointing ourselves in the right direction, but it doesn't necessarily give us any insight right away. And so when we take a look at this, we plot this one over time. This is looking at the errors. Sure enough, there was, and you can't probably tell from the plot, but this first orange bar here is the errors, but that's about 3 months where the errors were almost 800,000 a month. And so that's pretty bad. And then, it looks like they may have gotten it under control and it started to fall and kind of rebounded a little bit, but they got it back into control. The other interesting thing is this yellow bar, which is the page views with null page ID. And so it's just a tracking error. It's not necessarily an error, but there's something failing about the analytics themselves. And so that's interesting too. But you did notice there was a spike originally with the first set of errors. And when the first set of errors got contained, it actually came back. And so there's something really wrong with the tracking at that point. But you're probably losing data, and that's something really valuable to know. Because I've never actually seen this view. I didn't even know they were tracking this stuff in this xDB. So all kinds of valuable things pop out when you start to really look around. And so the engagement value, this is just a unique visualization, which is at the top. On the left, you'll notice the vertical bar of the dates. And so the ones at the top are the furthest away, they were the longest to go. The ones closest are most recent. And so you can see over time how things have changed. And so the engagement values are scored. Pages have specific points that they give you, or specific events have specific points. And so there's usually kind of a group of values around a single point, because like here, there's 10, or maybe at 18, or maybe at 35. There's some different scores being added or added up to getting you to that point. And so that's why there's kind of blank spots in between. But you're starting to look at things that start to say, okay, there's a lot of churn over here. What is it about this? I want to know something more about what's happening there. Are they different events that are triggering these? It's just like noise. Maybe it's something that's working, it's not working, or we're trying too many things, but it's not necessarily showing me growth. Over here, I actually am seeing growth. So at the very top, you'll notice it's kind of a smaller hill, and as we go down towards the more recent time, they're actually getting more and more people who are scoring higher and higher points. Not a lot comparatively, but it is growing. Something they're doing there is good, and we want to dig into that and know what that is too. Now we can take another look at campaigns. So we have all this data. Campaigns are actually one of the more interesting ones, and they did have 2 campaigns that were overlapping, which was even more interesting. Going to make the visualization nice because I could put them all in one spot here. But you can see that the blue one is basically about twice as large as the purple one, right? Campaign 1 is about twice as much campaign 2. And most of the metrics bear that out. Twice as many views, twice as many interactions, goals. But the percentage was actually relatively the same. So in some ways, they actually were similar, just maybe scaled up a little bit. Maybe more money was spent, maybe more time was better place that they advertised it. Who knows? But the person who probably set these campaigns up probably does know, and they could start to get a sense of how valuable or much time they spent in there, which one was more effective. But not to stop there, because we actually have so much data, we can keep digging deeper. And so if we go look into the individual campaign, we can actually break it down by the page types. It could be anything really, but it could be topic or whatever you want. But page types is a kind of relative metric that doesn't necessarily, it makes some sense. And so you start to see, we look at the campaign number of events, the how much engagement value, how break down the event types that occurred. But most importantly is this thing called exposure and reach, which are two metrics that are generated just for this, which really tell you about the multiplier. So if I create one page and 5 people view it, my exposure was 5. And then if 10 people, 10, 5, 10 total pages were visited, then my reach was 10 because my exposure was the original campaign. But if they kept clicking, then I got more for it. And so the multiple of the reach is actually pretty valuable. But what's interesting here is that this video page really did a pretty good job in this campaign. It really held a much higher multiple than anything else. And so maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe there was a specific thing about the campaign. You're supposed to watch a lot of videos. Maybe there were a lot more video pages. I don't necessarily know, but you could definitely say if you were marketing, if you were the marketer who built this campaign, this would help you inform you about where your time was spent. Maybe you spent a lot more time on the article pages and they didn't perform as well as the video pages. That's interesting to know. Maybe you should be just spending your time on videos. But there's all kinds of ways to help the authors know where their time was spent and get more information from it. All right, but now as we're building up, we're actually getting more and more sophisticated with our views. And so this one is a little bit, everybody's probably seen a map before. They usually just tell you where people are because all the cities are the biggest ones on the map. And that's not what I wanted to show you here. What I wanted to show you was something completely different. And this is really about who reads the most and who reads the best. And so the things that came out of this plot is so interesting. Because the main place, what we're looking at here, the bubbles, the size of the bubble is the average read time. So the biggest bubble is the one who they read the longest in minutes. And the fill color inside that bubble is how quickly they read. And then the border color is the number of pages that they read. And so this one right here is about 30 minutes, and that's Cyprus. I would put money that the client didn't know that their best readers were in Cyprus. But you could also, look around and see maybe roughly the other areas where maybe it's like 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, all around, what's going on in Brazil and South America, Madagascar. Okay, that's interesting. It's Southeast Asia. All right. There's so many different things that pop out that immediately I'm learning about just seeing it in this view. The other thing here is this one, you'll notice is really dark, like a orange interior. That's at 69 pages per minute. And so people are clicking very fast. They're not reading very much. But that's interesting to know too, because maybe I can ignore that. Maybe they're just not really interested. They got here some reason and they click quickly and that's all we got from them. The other thing is that this, I don't know if you can see it, there's a lot of bubbles in that little area, but the yellow border is almost 600,000 pages viewed just from that one area. And almost all of these are ISPs, so they're not necessarily distinct individuals, but you can get a sense of where they come from. And so that area really has a lot of volume reading pages, not necessarily reading times, but it is kind of interesting, to see how that distributes. So what I'm going to do in these next 3 slides is actually something more interesting. This is a 4-dimensional chart. And this is the same chart for the 3 plots I'm going to show you, but I'm going to zoom into different areas because what I want to understand is how healthy is this traffic? I had some concerns earlier, maybe that this was being bot traffic, but I don't know. I need to know. I want to understand what's happening. So what I'm going to do is pick one of each of these metrics, kind of zoom in on an extreme value for that and start to see what happens at that location. So in this case, pages per minute, I'm looking at over 60. That's pretty fast clicking, right? All the way up to 1200 or past 1200. And so what I want to know is when people are clicking really fast, what else is happening? What I'm finding is that all the visits are really below a minute. That's really good because that means people were clicking fast and they left, but they didn't necessarily stay long. They're not probably bots, right? A scraper is going to stay for a while. The other thing here I'm going to look at is the page duration over 60. So people who stay for more than an hour. Who stays for more than an hour reading? That's pretty awesome. That's really good viewership. And so what's interesting here is that people never really go over 1 page per minute. So really reading long time and they're reading relatively slowly, which is really good. And again, here I want to point out the page view and the item count, where the color is really bright, but the size is really small. That's where people are rereading things. And so you can see those around 0.1 of the pages per minute, all the way at the top. Those people are reading quite a bit of the same thing over and over, that's pretty interesting. And for a very long duration of time, probably something that really mattered to them or their business. And then there's this view, which is the extreme item count. So who read the most pages? And so this would be the most obvious of where a bot would be, right? If you were reading a lot of pages and you were a bot, you're probably scraping the whole site or something. And so you probably look for something that was looking pretty fast and staying for a really long time, but I'm not seeing anything like that because that would be off to the top and the right. What I am seeing is this kind of conversion point. You notice everything to the right of that is kind of light. The density of the opacity is indicating that there's just not as many people or visitors that are hitting really high page speeds. Most people actually read at a relatively normal pace, and when they do, they stay for a long time, up to a long time. So that's really interesting. This is a really good, healthy traffic. And that's just another thing that I've learned here just by going through this process of exploratory data analysis. And so what I want to do now is just take it back and look at the file system and how we actually can do this, right? So we've gone through, we've talked about the past, how Sitecore got to where it is. We've talked about what a modern data stack looks like, how to implement it, the problem that we're having with the data, how do we get past that? Once we do, what do we find when we get in there? And now we actually just need to take a look at how we implement it, how we actually run it, what the SQL scripts look like, what the tooling is, and what we can do. And so the solution architecture is something I'll dive into. It breaks it up into 3 different sections. One is the loading. And so there's different extracting SQL scripts. It's pulling the events and the interactions and the facets and the item content. And then the case that I was giving the example in, we had a 200 gigabytes to 100 gigabyte databases of xDB data. We processed that on my personal machine in 1.5 hours, which is pretty good. We able to move from its original data set into the raw databases. Then we did a transformation. That transformation took an hour. So 2.5 hours, we went from completely normal xDB data to completely useful stuff I can query and look into. And the transformation it's kind of has this, so this is where dbt lives, and this is dbt structures their projects into staging, intermediate, and marts. And so this is similar to Sitecore in the way that we use foundation, feature, and project layers. The staging would be the foundation. What it does is just references the database directly, brings that reference into the project, and lets you reference it in other places. Because once you have that reference, you don't need to keep copying that code. You can just say, I want to get that object. And that's how dbt really helps you manage breaking up large SQL chunks into smaller SQL chunks, making it a manageable project. The intermediate layers where you do a lot of the joins between a lot of those staging objects. And then the marts are the final tables that you want to construct. There's not a lot of action in there. Shouldn't really be a lot of action in there, really just to stamp out and finalize the view that you're looking at. And then there's a visualization, which is done through Jupyter Notebooks, using Visual Studio Code. And I'll show you some of the plots and how we do that. All right, so demo time. So let's take a look at the file system, because I do want to go back. Just give you an idea of how this really works. And so up here on the project, we have this run once. And so this is using Python to be able to set up your environment. There is some documentation here to just get you started. You have to install Python, create a virtual environment, which is just a running instance. It's kind of like an IIS app pool or something like that. And then there's plugins for the PowerShell or for Visual Studio that do different things to help you just manage the notebooks or use the tooling. And then there's package manager. So this is, once you have it installed and you have your your running environment, you need to be able to install the tools you need, which is kind of like an NPM or even a NuGet. So you install your packages. In this case, it's just these. You run it once. And then you have to install dbt, which is a command line tool. So you'd use your terminal here to call that. And then you have to have a dbt profile. This is really your connection strings, but you don't keep them in your project. You keep them on your local machine. It just references them from your project name. And then you start running your scripts. Once you run the loading script and you run dbt, which is your transformation script, you can start to run into mining, and then you start to use your PI tools. And so let's take a look at the first one, which is the on-prem loading. And so it brings in, has this run once, but it also has the other interior library. So from the packages that we brought in, we need specific things. We create these variables, we go get that profile from my dbt user, and then we bring that all those variables in, and then I can use a connection string, build a connection string. I have some functions that all they're doing is just wrapping what these are, but they're calling individual scripts. So we're just looping through the first extraction here, the second extraction, and then the content. So these scripts are all individual files. We can go and look at them here. And let's take an example. These ones are a little bit longer just because they have to run in one step. I'm not using dbt in this case for this stuff. Let's see, the events delta, this is a secondary extraction, but the original one is actually pretty large. So you have to run them twice because it's on both warehouses. But what you're doing here, you'll notice that this is opening that events column. And then within that, we have to do this JSON parsing. And so getting values out of that, putting them into a table, and this is the definition of that table we're going to create. And that's really what the loading is. Additionally, and this was something that was added on later, but you can export it to a Parquet file. So this folder's here just to do that. But if you wanted to be able to export to Parquet in the event, once you got your finished tables and everything, or you wanted to move all your raw data somewhere else, there's a project here, same thing, pulls up the connection. And then there's these couple of functions here that actually do the export to the Parquet format. And so you tell it which of the schemas in your database you want to export. In this case, I just the tables, the other schemas are for the views that run the export. And you'll see them all, the files getting generated into this folder. But that's really a common language among data professionals, so you can use a Parquet in a lot of different systems. And so that's loading. Transformation this is where dbt lives. So like I said, we have under models, there's the staging, which it's really just, the source is more from the definition. We already there's another file here called the dbt project where we define where the sources are. And so we're saying, here's the table. And so, and the folder, we're talking about the analytics. And bring that in, just reference it. Now we have an object that we can call, and we can say, we can talk to that. And so we go here and we would say, okay, now I'm going to refer to that intermediate events, and I'm going to do these calculations on it. And now I have another chunk, and another chunk, and another chunk. And these are all just transformations in their own that eventually build up into the marts. And so the marts would then bring them together, and you're basically just listing up the fields that you want to respond with. And so you have, kind of like another subquery here, and that we're going to use to join them and bring them all together in one spot. And so that's what the transformation is. You're just managing SQL through this tool called dbt, which is a command line tool. You run it from here. So you'd have to drill into the transform folder because that's really where the root is when you want to call it. And you'd say, like, new terminal. You'd say dbt run, and that would call it and start doing your compile and push it into your database. I'd have to change directory, but once it's in there, now we can start to do some visualization on it. And so that's the part I will show you. So these are, again, includes just getting the libraries we need, building the variables that we want to have from the file system. These are some of them are utility functions just to format outputs on the plots, things like that. And then the individual actual plot functions. So there's a bunch of different functions that do the plots. Database connections. You can see, these do run pretty quick because they're not really doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's really when you start to get to the querying. So the events is the first major query. That one takes quite a bit of time, maybe 15 minutes or so. But I can do one here. Goal is it shouldn't take too long. And I can show you what's happening as it does it. So this is the main query. So I go back and I just script the table to SQL, and I can put it in here. I can say this is what I'm looking for. I go and I get the connection and I say I want to read that SQL. And so we have about 16 seconds. I have some formatting on the time. Then I run some stats, just basic stats about how many entries there are, the column tables of the table. Then I can start to run some plots. And now I'm starting to see these plots all show up. And so that's really what we're trying to do here, is be able to have the ability to go in and look at the errors, look to do analysis on the IPs and interactions and contacts. And this is the one you get for the default one. This is one I've been working on for quite a while. So I can show you some of the outline here just to give you a sense of like how much there is in here. So for the areas, the interactions actually has a subsection of plots. There's quite a few plots. Not all of them I show here, but I have a lot that you can use in the contacts as well. And so this is the stock you get out of the box. This is this open source project right now that I'm working on. You can take this, you can run it on your own database, and you can start to get your own data. I'm not, the hope is that we can correct this problem. I think we've got a lot of people out there who use xDB for different things. They do maybe manage to get some value out of it, but I noticed there was just quite a bit of negative sentiment around it. And so I really would like to see that turn around. I want to try to change the narrative that the xDB data actually is really valuable. We just need to be able to get to it to show you that. Okay, so that is demo. That's the file system. That's how it works. And so it's a little complicated at first. I think you need to know how to set up the environment, use the tools. But I think that's a lot shorter of a distance than what we were facing otherwise. So I understand this is not necessarily for all Sitecore developers, but some may be interested, or maybe even some of the business people who have SQL skills and just need the system set up, or other data professionals that they can work with. I think this would be a much more common tooling for them, something that they would understand so much better and be able to get more value out of. And so that's really who the target audience is. It's kind of everybody. So, and a little bit more just about DBT, because there's like a whole course. It's like a very robust tool, but it is to manage SQL. It's really to help you navigate all the SQL scripts, so you don't have these giant scripts that you can't understand, or you can break them up a little bit and you start to join them together. You can start to see the relationship. But it's a command line tool, so you run a number of commands. Doc serve, what it does, it sets a web app on a local port, and then it gives you all the documentation. So you may have seen some of the YML files that went in with the staging SQL, and those just detail the fields and everything that you need. But those get rolled up into documentation, so you can actually take that web app and browse it and show other people and say, here, if you're just, we could host it somewhere, and you could get a sense of what the system looks like, and have some explanation for it before you dive into it. Debug, which is just a check for your connections. So it'll test to make sure you have the connection to the database, your username, your password work before it tries to do anything else. It's kind of like a pre-flight check. Then there's compile. So compile is really a reference check. It's kind of similar to what we do with, when we do .NET compiling. But it's really just a syntax check. It's trying to make sure that the language you're using, the references you have, the variables, and all the other macros and things you can add in, they work. It's before you go try to push it to the database and it breaks or something like that. And the run will actually do a compile and then push it and run it in the database. And then a build will actually do a run and then additionally do testing and any of the other things that you can configure, but I didn't get anywhere near with this project yet. So DBT has this thing different settings. One is materialization. So how are you going to create the script that you're creating? It can be a view, it can be a table, it can be an incremental, which is an incremental table. So it's a table definition, but it also has a query for getting the next most recent set of data. So you can say, based on the last value of this column, being past a certain time, go get the latest and just do an incremental build on it. Or an ephemeral, which actually doesn't create anything, doesn't create a view table. It just takes that query and it embeds it into the next reference. So wherever it's referenced, it puts the whole SQL right in there. I wouldn't recommend that at first unless you know what you're doing, because otherwise you could get really confused when it embeds that SQL and it doesn't run and it doesn't make any sense. So it takes a little while to get the hang of that, when to use it, but there is a good reason for using it. The schemas, which the schema in a database sense does refer to the structure and the column and the data types, but it also refers to the roles. So in the case of a lot of the Sitecore databases we use DBO, which is just like a public database profile. So you don't have any real control over it. But basically, if you want to be able to say this group in the business can only see these tables, you create a role for them, and then you can permission it, and that allows you to control who can see what. And then there's a bunch of links here. YouTube's the solution if you want to get figure out how to build a solution. Examples on Git, Jinja templates, which are like the templating framework, how they do the references and the variables and all the other things. DBT utils, which is kind of like an off-the-shelf, and it's kind of community built, but it really is like a bunch of useful tools that can come in handy if you're doing this a lot. And the SQL Server adapter, which you can connect this to a number of different databases, and every one of them is different. So you need the actual adapter for the database that you're using. In our case, it's SQL Server. And so there's a link here for that too. So exploring further, there's a lot of ways we can take this. Like I said, I didn't get to all the data. There's just so much of it. I mentioned that xDB has some really incredibly valuable data. Stop throwing it away, please. But there's all kinds of things you can do with it. And that I haven't done yet, and that we could continue to push this with. And so there's just different business KPIs, things that are relevant to most businesses that we could probably formalize, different MV tests and scores that were tracked that I never got into. Search and refer keywords, I got them surfaced, but I never actually got them to do much with them. Preferences and personas and profiles. I just didn't get to that. That was the one there, the unpack and the secondary. But there's just a lot of things you need to do to continue to process that data. So I just didn't get to it, but really valuable if we did get to it. So things that we can continue to look for as we go forward. And then, of course, probably the thing that I care about the most. Went through all this work just so I get to this point. I didn't get anything done in this particular project at this point yet, but I did want to get the data out so I could use it for machine learning and training models, because we can do so much more with it than you'd even probably think was possible at this point. And obviously everybody knows about LLMs and the value there, but you could be building functions for those LLMs that it could be talking to as trying to answer your questions. So you could be feeding different functions and into it and saying, when it knows when it's asked a certain question, or you can tell it like, this is this type of things that it answers. Use this function to get that result and weave that into your answer. But that's obviously one part of it, which I think where this could go, which is to integrate it with Stream, right? Stream could then take up those functions and say, we've trained a model, answers these questions. When you get that question, here's the data I need. You give that data to the function, gives you a response, feed it back to the user. So you could be getting questions about, like what was the traffic like yesterday, or how were there any errors? What was how many new conversions, whatever it is. And Stream could potentially go and find that information and bring it back to you and resolve it for you. We could be training models to feed rules and do decision tables or decision models inside personalized. So your rules could be saying, where a customer is predicted to be whatever within this range, or predicted to spend more than this, or spend more time than that. And then change the view to say, if you do, here's a coupon, or if something we think you're a specific group, here's another picture or video or specific content tailor to them based on the predictions that we were getting. And so there's a number of different ways we could use this machine learning outside of just that. Market basket analysis is one. So if you look at what an interaction looks like, there's just a series of things that occurred. And you can compare your interaction to other interactions and say, over the course of all the interactions, what were some common things that people were doing when they got to goals? Like what was driving those goals? And for most of the people. And we give you like the top like 10 or 20 or whatever you wanted to say like, here's the things that drive to goals. A lot of commonality. And you could start to maybe piece together something really informative about what it was that was helping your goals get completed. Clustering as well. So clustering is kind of like more of an analysis thing. What you're trying to do is say, look, we want to break this group up into a couple of different groups, and we want to understand what the attributes of those groups are. And so maybe it's some come late, some come early, maybe some buy more, maybe they prefer different types of products or specific types of topics they like to read. But it will really give you a sense of like what that group was made up of, what defines that group. And so it's an analysis thing, but it does lead to classification. So once you understand those groups and you're saying, okay, now I want to classify people, here's a bunch of people we know that fall into this group, into that group, into this group. Anybody else that comes in, compare them to them and classify them properly. And so you could do this in rules and segmentation and help really drive a lot of personalization to a better place with that. Regression also is similar where you're giving it values and it's doing a prediction, but it's doing a numerical prediction. Classification is a categorical prediction. And so how long they would stay, how much they would spend, that kind of thing. And natural language processing, if you didn't notice the search keywords and all that, and the content itself and topics and all kinds of things, there's so much like text that could be analyzed just for form feedback, things from social media, and all kinds of stuff. You could really start to dig in on what it was that people thought of your product or your experience on your website or what trouble they were having trying to do certain things, or what kind of content was related. You could do topic extractions. So there's just so many different things we could do that we could apply to content marketing with this data in the way that it is, with this model. So that's really where I would like to go with the next one. If you want to catch my next talk, that's probably where I'm headed. And so now let's assume you're interested and you're really, maybe I've made this case for you. You want to know how you can get started. And so the code is on GitHub. Like I said, it's an open source project. It's called Sitecore Data Tools. I went to the link to making this poster. Yes, it's AI generated. I thought that was fitting. And it's just to promote the Sitecore Data Tool. And if you don't know, I tend to make posters. I just like to. So it wasn't a hard sell for me. But I want to just encourage people to try to take this, dig in maybe a little bit. If you're interested, if you feel like this is something that you want to know more about, dive in. There's a ton of different things that you could look at. There's VS Code stuff, how to set up in Python environments, how to use Jupyter notebooks, what DBT is, if you want to know more about warehouses, Python itself, if you need to know quick references or just how to get done with plotting, SQL, if you need a cheat sheet. SQL is actually a pretty complicated language. It does a whole lot. DBT, there's a video series that I followed. It was really helpful to get me started, really gave me a good sense of what it did. In Power BI, there's a couple of different ways you could use it, but just understanding how that works. Data Factory, machine learning. I never teach you a full course of machine learning, but really it's just like, if you're interested in getting started, or maybe you already have a background or something, there's just some things you could do about looking into how Microsoft and Azure builds these projects so that we can implement a pipeline for machine learning models to be put into production. And really what we want to do is be able to put better data into customers' hands, because if we have better data, we have better insights. If we have better insights, that leads to better outcomes. And that's really what we're trying to do here. So thank you very much. That's my presentation on mining the xDB. Come see my next talk. Thank you.